Hello guys, this is Dimitri here from UH2 Design Academy. I thought in this video here, I'm gonna go and walk you through my process, my creative design process for one of the projects that was particularly challenging in doing in Blender. So it all started with a sketch, and it's actually the image that you see on my cover. So here's a better view of the project over here. So it all started with a sketch that I wanted to sort of create something that was quite nice and quite fresh, and I wanted to play a little bit more with the potential that tissue offers. So here's a little walkthrough. So there was a base mesh that we started doing it, and then after the base mesh there was some subdivisions and a lot of play to get it to the right level. And once we had the subdivisions in place, we went and tessellated everything with a panel, and we used layer weights. It's actually, the process is straight off of one of Alessandro Zomparelli's it's one of his plugins, one of his tutorials that he had online. Right, so let's get through it. So here's what the file looks like. This is the final file here. Oops. Let's see if I can find the elements. There they are. Right, so it's a very simple context, and there's a massing that sits in front of it, in between it. And it's essentially two sides that come together, and those two sides are exposed with the public space that happens in between. Actually, in here, just the plain old solid mode might be a little bit easier to see and understand. So all the red is glass, and then all the bluish here, the darker purplish, is also glass. So essentially this building goes from a solid, and then the facade opens up and becomes something a little bit more transparent where it's needed, and then it becomes solid again. So to get to this result, I went through a series of iterations. So this is the context, massing. So let's see, let's start from the beginning, shall we? So in here we have the original massings. And let me show you what the mesh looks like. So all of this was modeled with subdiv, and let me see if this is one of the baked ones. Yeah, this is already one of the baked ones. Let me see, maybe this one here isn't. Yep, so this one is not baked. So that's what it looks like. So it's the original base mesh was fairly simple. What I did also is create a lot of sketches within Blender. So I went to a few views. Don't know if I have those views saved anymore, but essentially I locked one view in, I turned everything off, and I started sketching the idea that I wanted to sort of progress. And it all again goes back to this original sketch. Where is it? It's over here. So it all stemmed from this idea with having something quite transparent, having fluid lines that wrap all the way around, and then being able to generate that in 3D. I can't iterate, and I keep iterating this at all points, how important it is to always start with a sketch and with an idea. If we have a better idea of what we want to create, then it makes the whole creative process so much easier. So I highly recommend it. It's actually even more important than having excellent 3D skills for the design process required. Now, it all depends what sort of work you want to do or you're interested in. If you're more interested in the 3D aspect, then perhaps somebody else in your team generates the ideas and then you just apply them. But for me, I absolutely love sketching, and I try to do it even more and more and more with all kinds of different devices. Right, so let's get back into the project here. Right, so yeah, this was like the initial step. We started with a very simple base mesh, and that kept getting modified and modified and modified until we got to a result that was satisfying. So let me turn off these sketches here. I have a grid columns, lamps. So that I'm just gonna go through like the organization of this file. So the first thing I actually did even before that was generate a context. Now the context, I probably spent a little bit too much time on the context here, much more than I should have, but I wanted to generate it and play with it a little bit. So that also has a base mesh. See if I can find it. Yeah, so I just did like a simple subdivision, and I don't think this is even it. Yeah, so each one of these base meshes, it's got a different material. So then I used Tessellate to generate the grid. So somewhere over here, not sure where, it may be in a, oh there it is, block modules. So these modules here went inside of each one of these grid pieces to generate our context here. So you can see we have one type, and then we have the second type, and then the general grid. So these were like sort of like the unique pieces, and you can actually see that this piece is very similar to that. It's just been distorted based on the context or on the block that it sits, but it essentially has 4 poly elements. So that's just a little bit of the context, and even the context started out with an initial sketch. Just went and drew something on plan, sort of like how I wanted to lay it out. So in there created an empty block sort of in the center of the whole sorry, sort of the whole chunk. And that's what this massing here is. Right, so this is how it looks when it was sitting in the context. And I'm pretty sure I did some more options beforehand to get to this sort of iteration of the mesh, of the poly mesh that we've got here, because it took quite a while to understand like how the topology works, especially in these central points here between the cores, to get to this sort of definition with the sharp edges and with the softer, almost like the underbelly of the building where all the fun stuff, all the public works happen. So let's just go through these. So the first one was, let's see, this is the original, and again that's what it looks like without the subdiv. Let's see, the next one in the stack is this, which is just the baked version. And then what I started doing is subdividing and separating different elements. So these are the areas that I wanted to tessellate in one way. And then this is the glass bit that goes in the center. And then this is the bottom edge. So it all starts from that same base mesh that I then subdivided. And here I think I just combined them in a different way. I may have even played a little bit more. Let's just see this with how it compares with this original mesh here. Yeah, so I remember this part here was fairly tricky. So what I ended up doing is rebuilding that quite a bit, as you can see, to topologically make sense in terms of the panels that I was after when we tessellate this property. So if I turn off this, so you see here that this is, for example, a little bit too dense once we start putting panels on there. So that's why I probably rebuild the whole thing. Let's see that again. Yeah, so in some areas it's still a little bit too dense, but the panel size is a little bit more like what I would expect it to be of a building for a building this size. So that was the first part, which was just working with the base mesh. And yeah, there was definitely another area, another work that was done beforehand to just play and massage the facade and the whole massing that took a long time to generate. Let's go on to the next layer. Alright, so this was one of the first iterations of the tessellation that I did. Let's turn off the context here for a second. And as you can see, I used those initial sections that we had set up. So the top got one type of tessellation. This bottom, the underbelly, got a different types of tessellation. And the panels are very simple. That's what they look like. So they have a little bit of detail. So they have a frame, then a mullion, and then a subframe, and then the glazing panel inside of it. And if I click on this, let's see if it's still active. Yeah, so in tissue, we can see like what the base is and what the component is, and the scale and the offset. So it's all still actually parametrically linked to the base mesh and the component mesh to generate this massing. And so this was the first try that I just trying to gauge the scale, trying to play a little bit with the panels. One thing I did as well was, and let's actually see if we can find it, MO1 vert base. So let's see if we can isolate it. So this was one panel. That's the side. I'm actually after this top element, MO1 diagrade base mesh. Right, so the only other thing I did in here is I played a little bit with the tessellation to make sure that the panelization is a little bit more standardized. And once we've got that settled, I added the modifier, or a couple of modifiers actually, to, let's go actually through the stack here. Let me move myself over so you can see that better. And I'm gonna turn on wireframe. So that's the general one. So if we turn off these, so that's the sort of the baked base mesh, if that makes sense. We had an initial mesh, we subdivided it, then with the subdivision mesh we continued to work and play with it until we get something that we're more comfortable with. And once we have that mesh, we continue the process again. So that's where we're at this point. So that's the second base mesh. So then that gets subdivided again. Then we use the decimate modifier with unsubdivide to one iteration to get a diagrid. I saw this in a tutorial somewhere. It's the most amazing thing I ever found out. It's the simplest way to really quickly get to a diagrid. And then we use this here. So again, I learned this from Alessandro's tutorial, and it shows weight proximity. So if I go now into weight paint, just turn off the wireframe. So you can see how there's a sort of a weight map happening here, and this is based on an empty. I have no idea where it is, to be honest, but you can see that the empty is somewhere around this area. And if we move that empty around, it will shift the whole vertex weight. This is really nice way to do sort of gradients of tessellations or of mappings, as is done in this project, because it looks much better than trying to do it smoothly by hand. Everything is the proper gradient, the proper fall off that you would expect to have. By doing something by hand, I do it a lot for painting people with particles, but in this case it would look probably a little bit off, because you would look at like a line, for example, and you would think, why isn't that in the right place? Okay, so that's the modifier stack that we have here. Let me exit out of local mode. Yeah, so where am I? Weight paint, object mode. So if we go into tissue, settings, panel diagram. Yeah, so I was just wondering which panel was used. So it's this one here. So very simple panel, but because we're using a diagram, it looks more interesting. And then also because of the weight paint, there it is. This is the empty that determines the amount of weight paint and the vertex weights that we're working with. And you can see how these panels here are a lot more open than the ones down here. Okay, so that was sort of like the first iteration that I did, that I was kind of happy with, but I knew it's a start. And as we all know, within architecture, within design, it's a very iterative process. So we look at something, we go away for a couple of days, or in my case weeks, because there's a lot going on, and then I go back, I'm like, oh, okay, this works, but it just doesn't feel right. So the next iteration, let's just go here to the file, sketches, was this. So, and I have some nicer images of this actually. So this is on my website. So that's what kind of where it landed, and I'm pretty happy with it. Some of it is just by sheer luck, which is the rotation of these elements, but let's go and check out how this was generated. So this is the model, and again it's fairly basic. It's divided in two areas. We have the top and we have the sides and the underbelly. So let's open and expand the layer. Collection, sorry. Blender weird terminology. So let's go ahead and turn off everything. And then go one by one to see what's going on. These are floors, these come later. And as you can see, in a lot of these I have a lot of series of iterations. Okay, so that's the initial base. That's the initial side base. And as you can see, these actually don't look too different than the base topology that we were using for the previous iteration. Getting a drink of water. Okay, so then what I did is actually bake the diagram out so I can modify a couple of things, especially around the corners. There's always some issues when the diagram goes to the edges. That's a panel. Let's see, I think this is the panel that we ended up using. So M2 base top and P2. Let's go check out the tessellation. So if I click on it, let's see, M2 base top and panel diagram.002. Yeah, so this is the panel. Excuse me. This is the panel that generated this form. So as you can see, it's fairly simple and it's linear. So that's what makes this quite nice. So we're working with a diagram, and within the diagram we're using something that's linear. So in a diagram that's 45 degrees in one direction or 45 degrees in the perpendicular direction. And then what was also quite nice is that the rotation is quite random. Now this was by sheer accident and luck, but sometimes those accidents, they end up being the result that you were actually looking for, and yeah, so that's sort of what happened here. So let's what I want to do is actually see if we can recreate something similar now. I'm gonna put myself over here, and let's turn off this tessellation. I'm gonna grab my base mesh, my panel. Let's go to tissue, tessellate. So we want to use modifiers for both. And let's see what happens. component. Okay, so I have my elements flipped. So I'm gonna undo that. So I'll select first the component, then the base mesh. Let's try it now. So base is correct. Correct. And let's try that again. Yeah, so it generates the same sort of quasi-random rotation. And that's great. So the next step is using the vertex weights to generate the variations that we're after. So now if we go and expand our tissue settings over here. Oh, some things have changed actually. Yeah, this plugin gets updated very quickly. Alessandro is great with that, and he constantly adds some great optimizations and features. So let's just see now if I can find rotation, weight, and morphing. Okay, so now it may have done it. Oh, something has changed. Yeah, I probably can't recreate that. Actually, let's go back and see this, because before it used to be with shape keys, but now it's saying use shape keys is not compatible with use modifiers. So let me hide this mesh. Let's go back to this tessellation, and actually let's take a deep dive and explore the settings. So let's see what's happening here. So we have use shape keys and use. Oh, I see. So I had set. Let's just see if we can get back to our mesh here. I set use modifiers, and that's why I probably baked the diagrid before doing it. So if we don't bake the diagrid, we should be okay. Let's see, one more. Undo. Hopefully faster undo is coming very soon to Blender. Very excited about that. I cannot believe. And this is not even that complex of a model, but it takes quite a long time to get to what I need to. So very excited about that feature. Alright, back on point. So let's hide this. Let's try tessellating again. So I'm gonna uncheck use modifiers for the base. And I don't think we have any modifiers here. Let's open the advanced settings and go to map vertex groups and use shape keys. Yes. That should give us the result that we are after. Almost. Okay, so we do need to use modifiers for... Now, if you can tell, it's been a while since I looked at this project. Maybe I did it in October and now it's March, so almost 5 months. Maybe I've opened it once or twice since then, but it's good to get back into it, to understand the settings a little bit more. So, let's see now. So we do need to use some modifiers. Let's see if this works. Yep. So we can use modifiers on the base top, not on the component. So now when I click and we open shape keys, in here we select our vertex group, and here we go. Yes, we got it. That's the recreation. I'm gonna do a proper tutorial on this because it's kind of an advanced step, but the results we can get are absolutely fascinating. I've used this on a series of projects in the office for competitions of all kinds, because it gets you really good results really fast without having to go and do everything like I would usually do it in Grasshopper. In Grasshopper, you can get to fairly similar results fairly quickly as well. It's a little bit more involved though. And the trouble is, once we set up a node sort of graph for one option, going to another option is a whole different process. Whereas in here, it's just a base mesh that varies in the components, so it's fairly quick. I'm sure there's a lot of Grasshopper wizards out there that can do this in like no time. For me, I still consider myself a intermediate to advanced Grasshopper user, and doing something like what we've got here will still take me a fair bit of time. Certainly much longer than it would take me to do it here in Blender. Right, so now we can modify the value, and it sort of impacts the intensity that we have of the weight groups. Okay, so I'm gonna delete this, and let's continue going through the file. So what's this? This is some plane. I think I was using some shots before. Yeah, I think at some point I went around and I did some additional elements inside, which you can see here. We have floors, and I have a series of floor copies, and we created a base. We put some people, and I believe I have some columns in here as well, and somewhere there's a duplication. Let's see where it is. Okay, I have floors and floors, all three. Yeah, so we have floors. I did some balustrades, did some people around. Let's see how they look with this setting. So all these elements, the more we do them, the more realism it adds. Now naturally we're doing with concepts, so we're not going to go and model every single mullion and every single interior partition, but having some of the basics, like having columns, having some people that give a sense of scale, and some basic balustrades already helps the project a lot significantly. So now if I turn on the two tessellations, make sure wireframe is off, turn off these. Yeah, so that's what we get to from this process. Now, if I hadn't started with a sketch to get to this level, would have taken me significantly longer. Now let's see what else is in here. We have some people. So I always populate people around my scene. I don't know where they are. They're hiding somewhere. Maybe they're inside. Oh, okay. So this is the group that I usually use for that's the group that gets duplicated for all the areas. So I need to redo a people's tutorial, because I have one for Blender 2.79, but I need to show how it works in 2.8. So let's turn back the context. Let's go in here, turn off the collections. So let me know if you find these sort of walkthroughs to the creative process useful, and we can definitely do a lot more of them and go through a series of projects and just show you how they're built. So they're not exactly tutorials per se, but they give you a sneak peek behind the creative process that happens in the background of any architecture design process. Did I say process enough times? It's a very important word. And yeah, in the end, I rendered this with cycles, because I've gotten a little bit better since then with TV, but it's still, I can't get it to the same depth and resolution as I can with cycles. So I'm just going to turn on cycles here, just to show you what it looks like within cycles. And I probably have some cameras set up somewhere. let's activate one. Let's try some other cameras. Yeah, so as you can see, I was having some issues here with the glass, and in some angles it looks strange, but I think on my website, so what I did is I had to choose an angle that I knew works in a way that doesn't impact the glass. Yeah, so the idea is that even with something like this, we can go and look at the context that we have here and add a little bit more detail. Because this is looking very, well, it is something that we do all the time in the office, which is have as simple buildings as possible and then work on the context that we can show to clients, offer competition, and generate as many of these as possible. We don't necessarily have all the time that we wish to spend on generating the context, and that's always something that I struggle with in my workflow, is how do I generate nice images with decent contexts? And I still don't know the answer, really. I guess I need to put more time into it to do and show that. But in here, the only thing I've done is, let's go down to Street View. Yeah, so as I was saying before, I put some people in there and I modeled a context. So let me go back to Cycles View. So I modeled a context around with the blocks, and the blocks were done with Tessellation, by the way, as well. I started with one simple block, and then that block was rotated around and shown with all these options here. So even with this, it helps significantly with just a little bit of context. And my people are very crappy as well. I try to use them as low poly as possible. I think I made them with Make Human, and I went around and simplified their poly as much as possible so I can iterate and put as many as I want to. Let's see if I can increase the count actually now, just to show you how well they perform. Particles. Let's put 2000. Now we're gonna have a lot of people around. Let me go into this kind of view. Yeah. We filled everything. Nope. And I limited the area in which we have people. Wow. It's like in an earthquake, you know how everybody comes out and they want to stay as far out as possible. Just looking out. But yeah, so that's the design process with, and you can see, there's if you look into the detail, there's some people that are peeking out here because the height is not the right amount underneath of where these guys are, but that's inevitable with like quick concepts, and most of the time you won't even see it, so that's quite alright. I actually haven't even looked at how this building looks from the inside. It's fairly interesting. It's nice. There's something missing. Is it this tessellation here? Not sure what's missing, but there's a gap in here that I think was filled with these corner frames that I did. Yeah, so again, very basic. The idea here was to spend a little bit of time on the overall concept without worrying too much about the details. And hopefully this gives you a good idea of how this works. So please click the like button if you like these sorts of videos, and if you want to see more of these, let me know in the comments or something else, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks very much and see you next time.